please open your Bibles to chapter 23 of Acts, Acts chapter 23. We're going to move pretty quickly into Acts 24, but we're going to start Acts 23, verse 23, just to set up a little bit of context for where we're headed. This being the commander of the guard, calls to him two of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the third hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter having this form: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent Governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, 'I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also,' giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium." Verse 1. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with an attorney named Tertullus. And they brought charges to the governor against Paul, and Paul had been summoned. Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, "Since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness." So they're trying to butter him up here. Excuse me. "But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us by your kindness a brief hearing. For we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our own law, but Lysias the commander came along, and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you." I mean, you just saw the letter that Lysias wrote to Felix, and now you have this attorney along with the high priest Ananias and some of the elders coming down, and they're painting a very different picture than what Lysias has just presented. And I mean, it's courtroom talk. It's the same 2,000 years ago as it is now. You have lawyers who are trying to spin the story to try and get the verdict they want, which is whether it's to turn Paul over into their hands or to have Paul killed. Just the language that's used here to describe Paul: he's a ringleader of the Nazarenes. He stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. He tried to desecrate the temple, and then Lysias, with much violence, took him out of their hands. I mean, that is not quite the picture that we have an account of earlier on, but it's the picture that they're wanting to paint here. "By examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you will be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him." The Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. When the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 years ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone, or causing a riot. Nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law, and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience, both before God and before men. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation, to present offerings, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified without any crowd or uproar. But there were some Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you and to make accusation if they should have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council, other than for this one statement which I shouted out while standing among them. For the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today. When Paul gives his defense, he just says that he's serving the same God that the Jews are, that the Jews worship, but in a different way. And he, where is it? Hang on. In verse 14, he says, "But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers," the fathers that he shares there with the Jews who are in attendance, "believing everything that is in accordance with the law, which they also believe, that is written in the prophets, which they also believe, having a hope in God, which those who were there, from the Jews who were there, they cherish that same hope." They also have the same hope. They're just trying to accomplish it in different ways. The Jews are resisting it and not seeing the fulfillment of the law. They're maintaining their old ways, where Paul is working with the way, with the Christians to spread the fulfillment of the law. And then he says, "In view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience, both before God and before men." Even if, we as Christians, our standard of morality, our standard of right and wrong is set by God. There are many people today who try to reason through the eyes of men to have their own standard of right and wrong, of goodness and badness. And Paul's saying here that he tries to maintain a clear conscience before God. And if that's not enough, then before men also. Even if you aren't using the same standard by which to measure right and wrong, that is by God, he has not done anything against man also. So if you're looking for spiritual law or physical law or whatever it might be, he's maintaining a clear conscience. He says, look, I have not done anything wrong. I've not done anything wrong before God, and I've not done anything wrong before men. And then he just gives kind of a timeline and ends it with the most recent thing being going into the temple, and follows the very things that we discussed in depth last week. He goes in to be purified. He goes in to follow the same things that all the other Jewish men were doing, and when he gets there, they attack him. And then he calls out at the very end, when he saw it, when he was there with the guards, and he had the Sadducees and the Pharisees in the room with him, and he wanted to cause dissension between them, to have them kind of fight each other. He says, the one thing that I did was talk about the resurrection of the dead, and that's why I'm on trial before you today. But Felix, verse 22, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case. So Lysias knew that there would need to be others there present for the trial to be heard. He himself did not go. The Jews who were making the accusations against Paul, they went. Felix needed them there for their trial. But now Felix, who understands the way, which is a good thing, we can look at this, and as we keep reading and we see the results of what happened here, we can say it's providence. It could just be coincidence. I tend to err on the side of providence over coincidence. That's probably a whole different study for another time. But Felix, the person who is hearing the trial here, understands what Paul has been doing. It doesn't say that he's a Christian, but he has an understanding, a comprehensive understanding of the way. He knows what Christians have been doing, and if he has a more exact understanding or more exact knowledge, then likely he would have understood the relationship between Christians and Jews. But regardless, all we see here is that he delays the trial any further until Lysias is going to come down. Because even the Jews they call Lysias by name. They say that he took Paul away with much violence. And the wisdom here from Felix, not to say, well, I just trust what Lysias said in his letter, or I trust what you're saying here in front of me, is we're going to get everyone in one room. We're going to hear what every single person has to say. Paul, Lysias, the Jews here who are making these accusations, everyone's going to be in one room together, and we're going to decide this. And then, one second. Then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. But some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. So whether Felix's understanding was from all of the different governing he had to do, or whether it was from his wife, Drusilla, regardless, he would have had a pretty good understanding of the Jewish faith because of who he was married to. But Drusilla wants to hear what Paul has to say, and it's an opportunity for Paul to preach to the wife and to the governor of this area. And it says that Drusilla was with Felix. So it's not that just he's preaching to Drusilla, he's preaching to the governor of this area, someone who held a lot of power. We've seen years worth of Paul's mission work already by the time we get to Acts 24, where he has preached far and wide. But here he's preaching to one person or to two people who have a lot of influence. And what they'll be able to do with this knowledge could be a powerful thing. But as he was discussing righteousness, verse 25, self-control and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you." And this is it's kind of an incredible thing. We see that it was these three topics: righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come that frightens Felix. And shouldn't that frighten all of us? Yeah. For those of us who are Christians, who are in the body of Christ, it's a fear that should keep us doing what we set out to do when we were baptized, when we started to follow Christ. For those of us who are not, it should be a different type of fear. And Felix, not being a Christian, heard what Paul was saying, and it scared him. The judgment to come surely would have been enough, but when he's talking about righteousness and self-control, those are some of those standards that God sets for us. And if being righteous or striving to be righteous and striving to maintain one's actions and thoughts for someone in power can be a very difficult thing. The decisions you have to make, whether it's to please the people or to please God, or if he had an understanding of the way and he was married to someone who is Jewish, and so he would have understood the concept of the one true God, and known at least what the history said God's power was. And if he had an understanding of the way, then likely he would have heard of some of the miracles that were being done in Jesus' name through God's power, and would have known of his existing current power, and knowing that whether he was struggling to be a righteous person, or knew that by Paul talking that he wasn't a righteous person, or maybe he thought he was, but then during the discussion around self-control, whatever it was, it frightened Felix. And because of that, he says, hang on a second, I can't hear any more of this. I don't want to keep talking about this. And so he sends Paul away. And then he says, when I find time, I will summon you. At the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. So money would have been important to Felix. Again, being a person in power would have gotten to where he enjoyed a certain lifestyle. And I'm sure there were plenty of other prisoners hoping to get out of prison, or probably wasn't prison as like we would think about it. It definitely wasn't prison as Paul had known it to be in other areas. He had been in dungeons, and this was a prison where he had some freedom. His friends were able to come and visit him and minister to him, but still would not likely have been where Paul wanted to be. But other people also would not have wanted to be in that same position, and likely would have paid Felix, set a precedent that he expected Paul to follow also, to pay him to let him have more freedoms, to let him out of prison, or to give him a positive verdict so he could return to his previous lifestyle. We don't see that Paul ever paid him, but Paul did go and converse with him. And after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul imprisoned. So whatever Felix wanted out of the situation, he never got what he wanted, and instead of freeing Paul or giving him that verdict that would free him, he wanted to do the Jews a favor. Again, whether it was influenced by his wife, or whether it was just the influence of power that the Jews held, the very power that they didn't want to give up. He wanted to do them a favor, so he just leaves them in prison, which also goes to show that he probably could have freed him before this new governor comes into office. That maybe he could have had, final pardons or whatever it would be before the new leader comes in, and he doesn't do it. It says that he left him imprisoned.
Jonathan.
Yes, sir.
Secular historians have not given Felix a very good report. He's reputedly a very wicked man who had a wife that did not belong to him lawfully, and righteousness and temperance was two things he had never practiced in his life. It's a little wonder he trembled. But Paul addressed the man's needs where they were.
Right.
He needed the very thing. So little wonder he trembled, but he didn't respond.
That's the study of secular history, alongside of what we have, it's a fascinating study, and it's one that it's an area that I definitely want to grow in, and when I'm in classes and people start to talk about what's going on and from these other historical accounts, and what it can tell us about what we read here. I mean, even that fact you shared about Felix and the very things he struggled with are the things that the Holy Spirit records here that he was afraid of.
Politician,
Right. That's what it sounds like. Acts 25. Festus, the next governor, then having arrived in the province 3 days later, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul, that he might have him brought to Jerusalem, at the same time setting an ambush to kill him on the way. I wonder if they've eaten or had anything to drink since then. It's been 2 years, so they're probably pretty hungry and pretty thirsty. But seriously, about the note of time, I mean, this is 2 years later, and they are still on about this guy. And the new governor comes in, and they say, okay, well, now it's time to see what he's willing to do. Let's test his boundaries. Felix wasn't willing to completely give us what we want. Sure, he left him in prison, but now it's kind of done us a favor, more so than just having him in prison. Maybe we'll get a chance to finally kill Paul. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea, that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore, he said, let the influential men among you go there with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. I think about this. I think about Festus coming into power, and there's this maybe like reading of the scrolls or conversation between governors of, hey, this is where this thing's hidden in the governor's mansion, and you got to hit the washer just right for it to kick on and that kind of stuff. And then he says, oh yeah, and Paul, the guy that we've got in prison, Jews really hate him, and they want to kill him, and they've been on about this for about 2 years. Whether anything like that ever happened, I don't know. But Festus is in Jerusalem, so he is surrounded by many Jewish people and leaders, and as they're asking him to do this thing that they wanted Felix to do but wouldn't do, he's not swayed by them. I mean, a new governor likely would have wanted to gain rapport with his people very quickly, and sure, you're in their hometown, you're on their home turf, and you want to do them a favor, and you want them to support you, and they're this distant province that you need to that in your absence of not being there, sure, you can gain their favor very quickly. But instead of doing so, he says, no, Paul's going to stay where I've got him right now, and if you want to continue this long and drawn out process that you've had going for a few years, you come down there and prosecute him the right way. Let's try to do this the right way. After he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea, and on the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. So as soon as he gets back, this gets in motion. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. While Paul said in his own defense, I've committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. So it's a comprehensive defense. I've not broken any law. Any of the laws that you could possibly say that I've broken, I've not broken them. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you all very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. He says, look, if I've broken a law and that law says I need to be killed, absolutely. But I haven't done anything. And here we saw Festus, trying to gain favor with the Jews. But he doesn't do it in a way where he just hands down the judgment to say, okay, well, I'm tired of dealing with this. You need to go back and be with the Jews. And Paul, in his defense, says, I'm standing trial where I need to stand trial. Moving on halfway through verse 11, he says, but if none of those things is true, of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So he realizes that Festus does not have, not even his best interest, but doesn't even have the law as his best interest at heart. He's looking to placate this group of people who are clamoring about Paul, and he realizes that his only way out of this is to go higher up. He can't stop with Festus. He's got to go to Caesar. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, you appeal to Caesar you shall go. Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice had arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. Excuse me. While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man who is left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they had assembled here, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion, and and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial in these matters. Well, when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would also like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. I love how Festus sums up the charges against him. He says, I don't know, like they just had some questions about their religion and about a dead man named Jesus, and Paul said that the guy's alive. I don't know. So I just thought maybe it'd be a good idea to send him up to the Jews and they can deal with him themselves. But he appealed to the emperor, and so that's what we're going to do. It sounds about as ridiculous as it actually is whenever he describes it. The Jews are just up in arms, and it sounds like it's almost over nothing, but there's so many ulterior motives behind what the Jews are doing that it has incensed them to fight as hard as they can fight to try and convince their leaders to put this man to death or to return him to them. Verse 23. So on the next day when Agrippa came together with Bernice in great pomp, with Bernice amid great pomp, and entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. So here Paul's been able to preach to Felix, or to share the gospel with Felix. Festus was able to hear, probably not as much as Felix was able to hear, but some, and whether the ground was not right for him to plant the seed, or whether the timing wasn't right, he likely, at that time at least, was not able to hear the gospel. And now Paul is going to be able to share his defense with King Agrippa. So it's more power and more power within the region that is able to hear the message that God wanted Paul to spread, wants us all to spread. So Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my lord. Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me, in sending a prisoner, not to indicate also the charges against him. I mean, you have to think about the relationship between the governor and the emperor, and how frustrated the emperor would be if the governor sends a prisoner to him without even the charges. Excuse me, Caesar, I would like you to hear the trial of this man. And then Caesar says, what an incompetent governor I have down in Caesarea who doesn't even send the charges along. So maybe he would write back to him and say, oh, what's he on trial for? And then Festus would say, man, I wish you wouldn't ask that. I was hoping you just figured it out on your own. So he knows that he's got to send some charges to the emperor. And even though King Agrippa said, look, I just want to hear what the man has to say, Festus sets it up as, yes, you're going to get to hear what he has to say, but by the end of this thing, I need to know what charges to send along. So let's listen to what he has to say, and maybe we can figure it out together. We can send these charges along to the emperor. Chapter 26. Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. In regard to all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I am about to make my defense before you today, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. So apparently King Agrippa has a good understanding of the old law. And he says, I'm going to say a lot of stuff, but I need you to listen to all of it. Don't jump to conclusions as you're hearing things. If I say something that might shock you, just listen to me patiently. He's glad that he understands the Jews and their law, because the foundation of the gospel, the foundation of everything that Paul believes, that we believe, started with the old law, and what we believe is a fulfillment of that old law, and now that has been fulfilled, there is a new law. So he asks him to be patient. He begs him to be patient. And then he says, "So then all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem, since they have known about me for a long time. If they are willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee according to the strictest sect of our religion. And now I am standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers, the promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly serve God night and day. And for this hope, O king, I am being accused by Jews. Why is it considered incredible among you people if God does raise the dead? So then, I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prisons, having received authority from the chief priests, but also, when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And as I punished them, often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme, and being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them, even to foreign cities. While so engaged, as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and at those who were journeying with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, Who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things which I will appear to you, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the dominion of Satan to God, and that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who've been sanctified by faith in me." So here he sets up the foundation of his defense to say, look, I was a Jew of Jews. All the Jewish people knew me. They knew how devout I was, and they were with me as I was going out and persecuting Christians. And I was so passionate about doing so that I even did so to other cities. I left Jerusalem and I went out to find the Christians so that I may persecute them. And then while I was out doing that, Jesus appeared to me. The very person that the name that I was persecuting in others appeared to me. And then he was able to relate the words of Jesus Christ to Agrippa and the group that were there, specifically saying that as he's persecuting those people, as he's persecuting those Christians and what they're doing, he's specifically persecuting him, Jesus Christ. Verse 19, "So King Agrippa, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision, but kept declaring both to those of Damascus first, and also at Jerusalem, and then throughout all the region of Judea, and even to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds appropriate to repentance. For this reason, some Jews seized me in the temple and tried to put me to death. So having obtained help from God, I stand to this day testifying both to small and great, stating nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place, that the Christ was to suffer, and that by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he would be the first to proclaim light both to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles." While Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, "Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad." But Paul said, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth, For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul said, I would wish to God that whether in a short or long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. He asked Agrippa to be patient with him, and Agrippa is patient. Agrippa knows the Jewish law obviously better than Festus does, and it's Festus who interrupts. And he says, you're out of your mind. You study so much, and it's driven you crazy. And he says, no, I'm not. He's like, look, ask the person who has more power than you. Ask the, what do they say, the highest paid person in the room? He knows. And whenever he addresses, Paul's following the same game plan that he's followed in every city he's gone to. He has not performed a miracle in the room, so that's not part of the game plan. But it's the same message that he shares. He says, look, this is my own story. This is what happened to me. This is how I became a Christian. And this is the work that I did after that happened. And this account is powerful enough for King Agrippa to say, at this moment that Paul's been interrupted, in response to, look, for Paul saying, I know you believe the prophets, and King Agrippa saying, in a short amount of time, you're going to convince me to become a Christian. Instead of hearing his trial and letting him go or whatever it might be, Paul's defense, he knows, is not, Paul's never out for himself. We saw that when he was a Jew. He was out to do what he believed to be the will of our Father. And when he became a Christian, he was out to do the will of our Father. And whether that had a negative impact on his physical state on this earth or not. And so in this moment where he could be giving a defense to be freed from prison, he's preaching the gospel. And the defense that he's making is working. If he had made a defense to have Festus and King Agrippa let him go, or whatever it might be, maybe that's what would have happened. But he's not making defense to be freed. He's already made his appeal to the emperor. He's making a defense for God. And that defense is working because the king here says, look, you're going to convince me to be a Christian. And Paul's response is beautiful. He says, I wish to God that however long it takes, that not only you, but everyone in this room today would have the same conviction, would make the same decision and become a Christian also. And I love how he says it. He says, I wish that you'd become as I am. Paul knows the zeal he has for Christ. He knows how hard he's willing to work and the risks he's willing to take for Christ. And he says, I would hope that you would become as zealous as me, as hardworking as me, as devout as I am. But the way he says it, he kind of has an opportunity to use a play on words. And we hear in a lot of different lessons the use of humor and how effective that could be. Whether this was a humorous moment or not, he's able to call attention to his physical state. And he says, look, I would hope that you all would be like me, except I just hope you wouldn't have to be in chains. I hope you wouldn't have to be persecuted the way that I'm being persecuted right now. But that you would have his nature to serving God. The king stood up, and the governor and Bernice, and those who were sitting with them. And when they had gone aside, they began talking to one another, saying, this man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. It just shows where their focus is. Whether Paul appealed to Caesar to get out of his current situation there with Festus, or whether he was trying to get an opportunity to share the gospel with more people in higher power, or both. I mean, it doesn't have to be one or the other. we see that Agrippa and Festus, their focus is on his imprisonment, his physical state.